Imagine, just picture this. You're a teenager, 1983. MTV is king, and you're hanging out at the local shopping center after school, grabbing snacks at the convenience store, maybe calling your crush from the payphone. This was everyday life for 14-year-old Kelly Popleton until one December afternoon. She vanished from that very spot, only to be found murdered on a desolate California road. We're going to dive deep into this chilling cold case today. We'll examine the twists and turns of a 40-year-long investigation fueled by new DNA technology and the unwavering hope for justice.
It's so compelling, Kelly's case. It feels like it's so close to being solved. We have DNA, we have potential suspects, and we have detectives who refuse to let her story just fade away.
So let's go back to December 2nd, 1983, the day Kelly disappeared. What do we know about her last known movements? We know she was dropped off at school that morning in Fremont. It was a special school specifically for kids who were having trouble, like with truancy. And it's important to note that Kelly's family was going through a really tough time back then. They were dealing with divorce, moving, even facing eviction.
Yeah, it's crucial to understand the context of Kelly's life, you know? She was a teenager dealing with a lot of instability, and that vulnerability just makes this case even more heartbreaking. After school, though, that's when we get these conflicting reports of what happened. Some people say she went to her old apartment complex. It was kind of a magnet for teenagers back then. It had a convenience store, a shopping center. Think of it like the pre-internet version of the mall, the place where everyone hung out.
I could totally picture that. It's interesting how a place can become so important to an investigation. I mean, we even have a sighting of Kelly at that very convenience store. She bought matches and even used a payphone. Was she calling your boyfriend a friend? We still don't know.
Yeah, and these everyday actions, they suddenly become so significant when you're trying to put together the last hours of someone's life. But then things take a real turn. There are these two boys who claim they saw Kelly walking with two men near that same area. They described a cream-colored Plymouth Duster, a car that would reappear later in the investigation. Moments later, she was gone, and those men were running towards an apartment complex.
Wow, so we have conflicting sightings, potential witnesses, a mysterious car. It sounds like a lot for investigators to try and sort out. Where did they even begin?
Well, the immediate focus was on retracing Kelly's steps and interviewing anyone who may have seen her that day. But the early days of the investigation were marked by a really significant misstep, a false confession.
Oh, this must be the Trina story I read about, this 13-year-old girl who claimed to have information about the murder.
Yes, Trina. Her story was incredibly elaborate. She said there was this drug ring led by a man named Mario, and Kelly was killed for snitching on them.
Okay, a 13-year-old running a drug ring and orchestrating a murder. It does seem a little far-fetched.
It does, but what's fascinating is how she managed to weave details from the case into her story. She mentioned locations like the convenience store, Kilcare Road where Kelly was found, the bag over Kelly's head, even the type of car spotted near the abduction.
So it sounded credible because it aligned with some of the evidence. What happened when the police investigated her claims?
They went all in. Trina identified this Mario character as Julian Ramirez, and the police arrested him, along with Trina and two others that she named. They thought they had their answer.
It's incredible how a false confession can just derail an entire investigation, especially when it involves details that actually seem to support it.
Absolutely. False confessions are complex. Often they stem from a need for attention, a desire to protect someone, or even coercion. In Trina's case, it seems she was just a troubled teenager from a difficult home, desperate for someone to notice her. The real tragedy is that her lie led to innocent people being jailed, and it wasted valuable time.
It's a reminder that mistakes can happen even when you're trying to do the right thing. The consequences can be devastating. So with the false confession out of the picture, what did the investigators focus on next?
They had to go back to the beginning. Focus on the physical evidence found with Kelly's body. Remember the cream-colored Plymouth Duster. About 3 months into the investigation, they got a tip about a man named Juan Perez. He knew Kelly. He was known to deal drugs in the areas where teenagers hung out, and he drove a black Trans Am. Not an exact match, but similar enough to raise some eyebrows.
So they had a potential suspect who knew Kelly and drove a similar car. Did this lead anywhere?
It seemed promising at first. Juan denied everything, but he agreed to a polygraph, which came back inconclusive. They really investigated him thoroughly, but they couldn't find any hard evidence linking him to the crime. They had to let him go.
Another dead end. It's frustrating how many potential leads appeared early on, only to fizzle out. But surely they must have found something at the crime scene, something that pointed them in the right direction. What about the bags found with Kelly's body? Didn't they have some writing on them?
You're talking about the Welcome to Korea and duty-free bags. Yes, those were interesting clues. They suggested a possible Korean connection, which was not something investigators had considered before. Remember, this was way before DNA analysis could pinpoint ancestry. It's almost like they had a piece of the puzzle right in front of them, but they didn't have the tools to understand it yet.
It's amazing how much forensic science has advanced. Today, DNA testing is routine, but back then it was a brand new field. Did they find any other physical evidence at the scene?
They did. They found 6 distinct fingerprints on the garbage bag. They didn't belong to any of the first responders. They ran them through their databases, but no matches at the time. But that fingerprint evidence was carefully preserved. It held the potential to unlock this mystery in the future.
So they had fingerprints, but no way to connect them to a suspect. It seems like they were hitting one dead end after another. Were there any other details from the crime scene that stood out?
There was one peculiar detail, a 7-digit number scribbled on a piece of paper found in Kelly's pocket.
A phone number, maybe? A code? It sounds like something straight out of a mystery novel. Did they ever figure out what it meant?
It was a tantalizing clue, but unfortunately another dead end. They managed to track down the woman who had that phone number at the time, but she had no connection to Kelly or the case. It remains a mystery.
So many unanswered questions, so many loose threads. It's easy to see how this case went cold, but I have a feeling the investigators weren't ready to give up just yet. What happened next?
They started to consider the possibility that more than one person was involved. The way Kelly's body was found, the location, the lack of any signs that she was bound. It all suggested that it might have taken more than one person to abduct and kill her.
That's a chilling thought. Multiple offenders would make this case even more complex. Did they bring in any experts?
They contacted the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, hoping to get some insights into the potential killers. The BAU agreed that multiple offenders was a likely scenario, and suggested they were probably young men, unmarried, possibly involved with drugs and alcohol.
Okay, general profile, but it helps narrow down the possibilities. What about those other unsolved murders in the area from around the same time? Did they ever determine if there was a connection to Kelly's case?
That was a major concern back then. There were definite similarities between Kelly's case and the murders of other young girls in the area. Their ages, the causes of death, the remote locations where they were found. It felt like there could be a serial killer operating in the area, preying on vulnerable young women. They even investigated those notorious serial killer pairs like Charles Nang and Leonard Lake, comparing fingerprints and exploring every possible link. But those leads went nowhere.
So while trying to solve Kelly's murder, investigators were also dealing with the possibility of a serial predator. It must have been incredibly tense and frightening for everyone in the area. What was it like for Kelly's family during all of this?
It was a roller coaster of emotions for them. Hope that the killer would be caught, despair when leads went cold. Frustration with the mistakes that were made early on. Imagine being Kelly's mother, having to identify your daughter's body, clinging to the belief that the police would find her killer, only to have that belief shattered by a false confession.
It's heartbreaking to think about what they went through, the never-ending questions. Did they ever lose faith in the investigation?
Kelly's sister Amanda has talked about how their mother initially had complete trust in the police. She believed they were close to solving the case, but after the whole Trina situation, she lost all faith. They felt like precious time had been wasted, that mistakes had been made, and justice for Kelly seemed further away than ever.
That's understandable. But even in the face of these setbacks, there was one piece of evidence that still held potential: the fingerprints from the garbage bag. And with the advancements in DNA technology, there was finally a chance to re-examine that evidence and hopefully find some answers. But that's a story for part 2 of our deep dive.
So now we're in 2004, over 2 decades after Kelly's murder. DNA technology has come a long way, and investigators finally have a chance to go back to that fingerprint evidence.
It must have felt like a whole new chapter, a chance to finally get some answers after years of dead ends. What happened when they analyzed the fingerprints?
Well, they were able to get DNA from the fingerprints, and from that, they developed a full male DNA profile. This was a big breakthrough. They finally had something concrete to work with.
Having a DNA profile of the killer, that seems like a game changer. Did they find a match in any of the databases?
They immediately put the profile into CODIS, that's the National DNA Database, hoping for a quick resolution, of course, but no matches. It meant the killer probably wasn't in the system, which narrows things down a bit, but it also meant they had a much longer and more difficult road ahead.
So even with this incredible tool, they hit a wall.
Right.
What did they do next?
They knew they had to be creative and persistent. For years, 2 dedicated cold case detectives traveled all over the country, even up to Canada. They were conducting what they called a DNA dragnet, tracking down and testing anyone who had even the slightest connection to the case.
DNA dragnet? Wow, that sounds intense. What did that actually involve?
Imagine trying to find everyone who might have been in the area back in 1983. Anyone who might have crossed paths with Kelly even briefly, and then you have to convince them to give a DNA sample. It was a huge undertaking, but they were determined to explore every avenue.
It's amazing how committed these detectives were.
Yeah,
They just refused to let this case go cold. But all that travel, all those tests, and still no match, must have been so disheartening.
I'm sure there were times when they felt like giving up. But they never completely lost hope, and it's important to remember that around this time, other unsolved murders in the area were being solved with DNA. The ones they initially thought might be connected to Kelly's case.
So other families were getting closure. But Kelly's case remained unsolved. It must have been bittersweet for her family, seeing justice being served in those other cases while they were still waiting for answers. Did they continue to help with the investigation?
You can really hear the pain and frustration in Amanda's voice when she talks about this time. They felt forgotten, like their daughter's case wasn't important anymore. They still cooperated, they still held on to hope, but the years of waiting were really taking a toll.
It's a reminder that these cases are never truly cold for the families. The pain, the unanswered questions, they linger for years, sometimes decades. But even with these setbacks, the investigators weren't giving up. They were constantly looking for new approaches, new technologies, anything that could help them break through. And then in 2016, they made a decision that would completely change the direction of the investigation.
Okay, now I'm really curious. What did they do?
They decided to use this cutting-edge forensic technique called phenotyping. They sent Kelly's killer's DNA to a company called Parabon Nanolabs. They specialize in this technique. Phenotyping. I've heard of it, but it sounds like something out of science fiction.
Yeah.
How does it actually work?
It's pretty amazing, actually. They analyze the DNA and use algorithms to predict what a person might look like. They can figure out things like ancestry, hair color, eye color, even facial structure. And then they create these computer-generated composite sketches based on that genetic information.
So instead of relying on eyewitness descriptions, which can be unreliable, they can basically get a picture of the suspect directly from their DNA.
Exactly. It's totally revolutionized forensic science. And it's been really helpful in solving a lot of cold cases. And in Kelly's case, it led to a pretty shocking revelation.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat here. What did the phenotyping reveal about Kelly's killer?
It turned out that Kelly's killer was likely of Korean descent. This was huge. It had never even been on their radar before.
Wow, what a twist. And it makes you think about those Welcome to Korea bags found with Kelly's body. They had this clue all along, but they didn't have the technology to make the connection. How did this new information change things?
It was a total game changer. Now they could refocus their efforts, look at old leads from a new angle, and explore new possibilities.
It's like finding that one missing puzzle piece. Suddenly everything looks different. What were some of the first things they did after getting this information? Did they have any specific suspects in mind?
Well, you have to remember, this was 1983. There weren't computerized records back then. So going back and physically checking everyone who was in the area in 1983 and fit that profile was a massive task. But they started by making a list of known offenders of Korean descent in the area, focusing on those living closest to Kelly.
So they're combing through old records looking for anyone who fits the description and might have crossed paths with Kelly. It sounds like searching for a needle in a haystack.
It was a daunting task for sure, but they were persistent. And as they were doing this, they came across a name that really stood out. A man who had actually lived in the same apartment complex as Kelly around the time of her murder.
Wow, that's chilling. It makes you wonder if they had unknowingly crossed paths before. If this guy was hiding in plain sight all along. Did they test his DNA? Was he a match?
He did. And while they were waiting for the results, Detective Smith, one of the lead investigators, had another idea. He remembered a similar unsolved case from 1979, the murder of Francis Rash in Dublin, California. The suspect in that case was described as an Asian man in his late 20s, a description that matched Kelly's killer and those composite sketches from the DNA phenotyping.
So he was thinking maybe the same person committed both murders. That would be a huge break in both cases.
Exactly. Even if it wasn't the same killer, Detective Smith realized the Rash case file could have a lot of potential suspects, particularly men of Korean descent who lived in the area at that time. And he was right. He found an arrest log from 1984 about the arrest of 2 Korean men for kidnapping a woman in Castro Valley, which isn't far from where Kelly was last seen. One of the men was in his early 20s, the other in his early 30s, and one of them lived very close to Kelly.
So now they have 3 possible suspects. the one from Kelly's apartment complex, and these two from the Rash case file. It feels like they're getting closer. Did any of their DNA match?
They worked with the FBI to get DNA samples from all three men, and they waited for the results. Unfortunately, none of them were a match. It was another blow to the investigation. But the detectives weren't giving up.
Another dead end. I can't imagine how Kelly's family must feel. After all these years, they still don't know who killed their daughter. What options do they have left? Where could they turn next? So many twists and turns in this case. Even with amazing technology like DNA testing and phenotyping, they were still hitting roadblocks. What did they do next? Were there any other options left?
Well, they weren't giving up, and this is where it gets really interesting. Remember, it's 2016 now, and forensic genealogy is becoming a big deal. This technique uses public DNA databases like GED Match and Family Tree DNA to try and find relatives of an unknown suspect.
I see. So even if the killer's DNA isn't directly in the system, they might be able to find a cousin or a distant relative and then use that to build a family tree, eventually leading them to the killer.
Exactly. It's like a high-tech version of those ancestry websites. But instead of tracing your family history, you're tracing a killer's git.
It's incredible how something that started as a way to connect with your ancestors can now be used to solve crimes. Have they had any luck with genetic genealogy in Kelly's case?
It's a slow process for sure, building these complex family trees and chasing down leads that sometimes go nowhere. But it's been really successful in solving other cold cases. Detective Smith is optimistic that it'll eventually lead them to Kelly's killer.
That's good to hear. It's encouraging to know that even after all this time, they're still working on it, and they're using every possible tool. But while we wait for those answers, I think it's important to take a step back, to remember Kelly the victim at the center of this story. It's easy to get caught up in the forensic details and all the twists and turns, but at the end of the day, this is about a 14-year-old girl whose life was tragically cut short.
That's right. Behind every case file, there's a real person with a story. Kelly was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She had hopes and dreams, and they were all taken from her.
It's so important to remember that, to humanize the victims, to remind ourselves that these are real people, not just names in a file. What can you tell us about Kelly? What was she like?
Well, we get a glimpse of her personality through her sister Amanda. She's shared some memories about Kelly. She said she was a bit of a prankster, she loved Dungeons and Dragons, and she was a big fan of the Oakland A's. It's a stark contrast to the details of her murder, but it reminds us that she was a real person, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her.
It's so important to hear those stories. What has Amanda said about the case and the impact it's had on their family?
Amanda has spoken about the frustration and anger they felt over the years, the mistakes made early on, the feeling of being forgotten as time went on. But she hasn't given up hope. She continues to fight for her sister to keep her memory alive and to push for answers. It's really a testament to the power of love and the unwavering belief that justice is still possible no matter how long it takes.
It's inspiring to see her strength. Do you think they'll ever find the person who killed Kelly?
It's hard to say for certain, but I do believe that with the combination of good old-fashioned detective work, cutting-edge DNA technology, and the dedication of investigators in Kelly's family, there's a real chance that this case will be solved.
I really hope so. But even if they never find the killer, even if the mystery remains unsolved, Kelly's story will continue to remind us about the power of hope, the importance of never giving up on the search for justice, and the devastating impact these crimes have on families and entire communities.
Absolutely. And this is where we as listeners can play a role. We can help keep Kelly's memory alive, share her story, and maybe even contribute to solving this case. Sometimes all it takes is one person, one memory, one little detail to break a case wide open. So if you're listening to this and you remember anything about Kelly Popleton, if you were in the Fremont area in 1983, if you knew anyone who fits the description, please don't hesitate to contact the authorities. You can find all the contact information on the Deck podcast website, along with those composite sketches they created from the DNA phenotyping.
That's right. You never know, the information you have might be the missing piece of the puzzle, the one that finally brings justice for Kelly and closure for her family. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Kelly Popleton's case, be sure to subscribe to the deep dive for more in-depth looks at unsolved mysteries and cold cases.
We'll be back next week with a brand new case, and we hope you'll join us as we explore the world of forensic science, criminal psychology, and the pursuit of justice.